Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, November 6th, 2024, and today we are going to discuss leaves, and crop storage. So let's do it. All right, so I hope everyone had at least a manageable election day. The kids were out of school, so once I got the daily done and some stuff around the farm, we hung out, and that was nice. In the summer, they're here all day, but from like August until May, they are in school, which means that I don't get to see them quite as much during the day, which is a bummer. But our kids love school, the school that they're in at least. We homeschooled them for a while, but our oldest just flat out is too social for all that, and it was more torture for him than education. And now they love the school and that they attend, and they get to spend a lot of time outdoors. So I guess everyone wins, I suppose, except it means they are not here as much, which is definitely a bummer. So I enjoy when they're randomly out in the middle of the week. We get to hang out a little bit more with them around the house and the farm. While on that subject, the Seed Farmer podcast has an episode up today with Katie Kula, author of Farm Raised Kids, which is definitely worth a listen. Also, the first episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast went up this week, and I forgot to mention it. Jason Grauer, who is the Senior Director of Farm and Innovation at the Stone Barns Center in New York, was on, and that was very cool. That one is not about kids, but is a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at that really innovative and interesting place. So be sure to check those out. As for the election itself, I don't have a ton to say at this moment. I want this podcast to be really helpful and thoughtful and not just reactive. But that also means taking my time to process what I imagine could have a pretty significant impact, not just on our environment and ecology, but society as a whole. So if I can add some good perspective soon, I definitely will. In the meantime, a good, enriching, positive place to always put one's energy is in the soil. And if I'm allowed a pretty clunky segue there. And for the meantime, maybe we can just talk a little bit about composting leaves. Our neighbors started bringing leaves over yesterday, which is my actual favorite holiday. So there is a giant pile of leaves to explore, which I didn't grow up on a farm, but having a giant pile of leaves dropped off at your house has to be in the top 10 of every child's dream life. At least on our farm, the leaves don't stay just leaves for very long. To back up, our wonderful neighbors, very much the most amazing humans we know, have one of those lawns where the entire neighborhood's leaves seem to collect there. If they didn't collect them and move them, it would mulch out all of their grass. And it just so happens we, being the good neighbors that we are more than happy to take every single leaf they don't want off of their hands. So I'm going to talk about leaves in two ways today. In this first segment, I'm going to talk about what I've learned composting with leaves. And in the final segment, I'm going to talk about what I've learned mulching with leaves, like just raw leaves. In the middle, of course, we will do a Patreon question. But first, let's talk about that whole composting with leaves thing. To start, leaves are not particularly eager to become compost. They are highly carbonaceous. They contain no small amount of nutrients, but composting them must be done thoughtfully. It is not enough to simply pile them up and let them sit over the winter. In years where I have tried that, I have found whole sections of the leaf piles in the spring that were still dry and looked like I had just piled them there. Even after sitting in the rain and cold and winter, they just did not really decompose. I recommend that before you start collecting leaves, get a good nitrogen source and water source near the pile. And instead of creating a pile, you create some lasagna. Pile a thick layer of leaves, soak it with water, followed by a thinner layer of your nitrogen source, preferably manure, but could be fish meal if that's all you have. Then soak that, then repeat. You will need more water than you think, and the leaves will stubbornly reject a lot of it. Then once you get to the top of the pile, soak it again and throw a cap of old compost, if you have it, right over top to help hold on to the moisture, and or throw a tarp over top of that for the same purpose, but also to redistribute the heat a little better. Like as the heat comes up, the tarp will kind of just bring it down over the pile. I don't mind leaving the leaf compost pile uncovered for the winter in wet areas like ours, but I like to refresh the water at least once a week if it doesn't get a good soaking if I'm leaving it uncovered. Just soak the living daylights out of it with a hose. Now, I find that leaf piles are pretty hard to turn by hand until they have broken down for a while. If you have a tractor, turn the pile, then soak it again. If not, and you are growing commercially, you could consider building a static aerated system or something like the Johnson Su bioreactor. I would recommend researching all of your static aerated options. We built one, which is where our pile goes. Now, you still have to follow all the food safety guidelines as they pertain to compost. I will talk about that probably many times over the course of this show, but have discussed them at length in videos like the static aerated compost system video, which I will link in the show notes. Anyway, if doing this by hand, once the pile gets to a manageable size as it breaks down, then you can start turning it and making sure to not only mix all of the layers well, but make sure they are getting adequate moisture as well. I find that, at least here in Kentucky, this pile is usually ready by May or June if I did it right. You may find that as the pile breaks down, worms will invade and rapidly begin to shred and enrich the compost in ways that they don't necessarily do with wood chip piles. The end result is a light, spongy, beautiful compost that can act as an almost perfect nutritional compost, the most balanced and widely applicable of the 4 types of compost, as outlined in the Living Soil Handbook, which, in case you want to geek out on some soil stuff and help this podcast at the same time, you can pick it up from no-tillgrowers.com. Now, can you compost leaves without a nitrogen source? Yes, they will ultimately decompose. I find that the decomposition just takes longer and it requires more moisture monitoring because a lot of times that nitrogen source is helping to hold in the water while also providing the nitrogen required for decomposition. Without that, you have to wait until the leaves have broken down a bit more and the microbial populations start to pick up before the water will be retained very well. Also, the finer that the leaves are chopped, which our neighbor uses a mower collectors, so they get a little bit chopped up in the collection process. That will help speed up the decomposition in the pile itself, because the more chopped up something is, the more surface area it has. And the more surface area it has, the more access microbes have to it. Like the more microbes can pile onto it if it can get to all sides of something. Does that make sense? So the more microbes, the better for decomposition. Anyway, that is the gist of composting leaves. In the next segment, let's talk food storage. And then leaves again, but after the food storage. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. When you need proven varieties you can count on and detailed guidance from seeding to harvest, consider Johnny's your trusted growing partner. Their same-day shipping can help keep your planting schedules on track when the unexpected happens. They're here to help you grow good food. Turning to Johnny's means you can plant high-quality, trial-proven varieties with confidence and know that their expert staff is ready to help with first-hand knowledge, because they've grown them themselves. Learn more at johnnyseeds.com. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and want to support it, you can do so at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. If this show has become a part of your daily life and you can't imagine your afternoons without it, which awesome, please consider signing up for $2 or $5 a month or whatever you can afford to help keep this show going. I will try to get to questions from everywhere, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. Today's question comes from Patreon member Tom P., who writes, looking for some help with the best practices for longer-term root storage that's not a root cellar. I've been hearing conflicting info between stored straight in a covered tote versus a perforated plastic bag. Any insight? End quote. Thanks, Tom. Great question. Okay, so I think I mentioned in an early episode of Growers Daily that one of the things I like about this particular format, a daily show, is that I can cover topics that might not make a very interesting full-length video, but would make a really great 5 or 8 minute, segment in the daily show. Little nuances in food storage is a prime example. There is just so much to consider when it comes to food storage, from roots to fresh greens to tomatoes and to basil. Basil is the freaking worst, but I'll say basil for a whole other day because it deserves its own segment. So this show will absolutely allow me to cover all of that, which is fun and exciting. So I appreciate you all listening and giving me that opportunity. Also, I promised to get to Tom's question presently, but a new book came across my desk this summer that I did not get a chance to write any praise for, but I thought was really good, and in particular for this episode, called Beyond the Root Cellar by Sam Knapp. That comes out, I think, in December and is on pre-order now. I will link that in the show notes because it will definitely come in handy for growers on any scale who are looking to store food or preserve it longer into the winter. Okay, so back to Tom's question here. Yes, there is a lot of conflicting information between straight covered totes and ventilated bags because there's actually a lot of contextual considerations, not just for the crop itself, but for the environment in which you're storing it. So it makes sense that there's a lot of conflicting info. because there's so many different ways to do it and there's so many different things to consider. So from the sound of it, you both need storage container advice and storage area advice. To me, the first place to start is with the needs of each crop. On the storage container side of things, every crop has its own needs, but most of what I would call the juicy storage crops like carrots, beets, and radishes, those sorts of things, they require pretty cold temps, just above freezing for storage, and relatively high humidity and some amount of ventilation. So those are crops that you may use the vented bag liners or vented bags, but you wouldn't want to leave them in open containers like you would something like onions that like reasonably cold refrigeration temperatures, but not as high of humidity. A basic refrigerator is usually fine for the storage of all of those things. Potatoes can be stored closer to the high 30s, so that'd be like 3.3 degrees Celsius, but do fine in storage up to around 45 degrees Fahrenheit or 7.2 degrees Celsius for long-term storage. Things like winter squash and sweet potatoes like it slightly warmer, closer to cellar temperature or a little warmer than that. Start with understanding the basic needs of the crops you're trying to store, and then design your storage containers and storage area around that. That book I mentioned not only has an entire compendium for a bunch of different storage crops and what they need, but a ton of different case studies and ideas based on your scale, including how much to grow based on the typical loss rates. Seriously, it's going to be a must-own book for anyone hoping for any sort of like late winter produce. What I do for our cooler in the winter is keep the CoolBot unit, CoolBot just being an AC unit modifier that turns an AC unit into a compressor for cold air like a freaking boss. And I also use a thermostat attached to a heater. So basically, when the temp gets too cold, the heater kicks on, but too warm and the heater kicks off and the AC unit kicks on with the CoolBot. I will link the thermostat I use in the show notes. Just make sure you get a small heater that will kick on when the power comes on and does not have to be turned on every time. It's an important distinction. If I see the one that I use, I'll link that as well. We got it a long time ago though, so I have no idea if I can find it. It does not have to be big. Ours is like a little box. I'm not sure if that was super helpful or helpful enough for you, Tom, but if not, let me know and let me know what specific crops you'd like to store, and I can continue down that rabbit hole because there's no shortage of stuff to say about storing food safely for the long term. I mean, in a nutshell, the container you use or the plastics you use depends a lot on the crop and its relative humidity needs and whether or not it respires a lot of ethylene, which can speed up the decomposition process. So you just have to take all of those factors into consideration for each crop that you're saving. There's no like one size fits all. Okay, we're going to get a quick word from the folks who make this show possible. And when we return, we will return to leaves. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show. Okay, so in the first segment, I talked about composting leaves, and in this last segment, I want to talk about mulching with fresh leaves. This is one of those ideas that seems like a no-brainer. Leaves are loaded with nutrients, fungi, and worms go gaga for them. They mulch the forest floor really well. Why would I not want to mulch my garden with leaves? Well, you may indeed want to do that, but you also may want to be really thoughtful about how. First, there are a few places we mulch with almost entirely fresh leaves, but rarely on their own, and never near anywhere we plan to plant salad mix. We've made that mistake. In terms of having a nice clean product, it is easier to wash out almost any bug out of your salad mix than bits of leaves. Those places where we will mulch with fresh leaves, and by fresh, I mean freshly fallen from a tree. They are typically brown and dry by the time they get over to our farm, but that's what I mean by fresh. But the areas we use them is usually around our hedges and not typically in the garden. Even then, I like to cover them with a light layer of hay or compost to lock them in place. In the garden, I would prefer the light layer of compost over top and then allow them to break down over the winter a bit. I've also laid them down over beds and covered those beds with a tarp to keep them from blowing away and try to allow for the moisture underneath the tarp and the heat to help break them down. But like with the compost, without a consistent source of moisture, they're just ornery little things that refuse to break down much. The soil benefits a little bit, but the mulch is still just fresh leaves in the spring when you pull that tarp off that will readily blow away. If you laid drip irrigation over the leaves, I'm sure you could speed up that process, but dry leaves covered with a tarp is largely just a way of having dry leaves in the spring. You obviously can't work fresh leaves into the soil either unless you want to wait a year to plant that ground because the leaves will absolutely lock up the soil. Note that if the leaves you have are not already chopped up, like somebody just raked them up, you will need to chop them. In order to do this, if I have to do this, I just lay them down in the bed and then mow over top with a flail mower, also called a mulching mower, that's just going to put them right down in place. This is especially true if you were wanting to mulch over garlic or flower beds with leaves because they can create a significant weed mat that may limit some penetration by the desired crop. A little is fine, but a thick enough layer of leaves will cause the crop to struggle to get through. It's like a solid mat. All right, I'm going to leave it there. But hey, if you are watching or listening and either live in or are friends with people from France, Italy, or Germany, let them know my book is either available in all of those languages or very soon will be. All the links for those are in the show notes. That would be super cool. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube and there's ever something in here that strikes you as super helpful, there's a super thanks button that can show us a little love, and we appreciate that. Support like that and support like that from the Patreon page make this impossibly hard work slightly more possible. Huge thanks to Willie Breeding for the theme song. Thank you to the crew at No-Till Growers for their support. Thank you to everyone who has been listening and engaging and subscribing and following, and absolutely especially those who have signed up to be a Patreon member at patreon.com/no-till-growers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or if you just sign up in the month of November, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Aaron McLaughlin, Josh, Tracy Coleman, and T Reaper. I think it's T Reaper. Kind of sounds like I don't know. This sounds like, I think this quartet here, they kind of have like a dance vibe. I think this is a dance story here. And I think Aaron McLaughlin, clearly the dance instructor. T Reaper, clearly the dancer. Tracy Coleman is the pilot because they're on a desert island and they are on there for so long. They created a dance called The Josh, and kind of a YA. I think this is a YA book, and it's called Just Joshin'. Yeah, they get rescued. It's fine. Everybody has fun. Lots of tears. All right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all tomorrow.